The morning Benjamin Monroe rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1879, he had not spoken more than 20 words to any single human being in 3 weeks, and he had not made a promise to any living soul in 8 years, and he had no intention of changing either of those things before he rode out again. He came in from the north on a grulla mare named Cinder, a horse of ash and iron coloring that suited her rider well enough. Benjamin himself was 31 years old, lean through the shoulders in the way of men who have spent more time working than eating, with dark hair that had grown past his collar, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in a month. He wore a plain brown duster that had once been somebody else's coat, and a hat that had lost its crease somewhere in Colorado. He carried a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard, and a Colt revolver on his hip that he had not drawn in anger in over a year, and he counted that as the one good thing about the recent chapter of his life. Caldwell in the fall of 1879 was a town on the edge of everything. It sat right up against the Kansas Indian Territory line, which made it rough in all the ways that border towns tend to be rough, and ambitious in all the ways that border towns tend to be foolish. The cattle trade had made it prosperous and dangerous in equal measure. There were 3 saloons, 2 hotels, a mercantile, a blacksmith, a land office, and a church that had been shot through the east wall twice and repaired with mismatched boards both times. The sheriff was a man named Orrin Peel who wore his badge like it embarrassed him and spent most of his evenings in the back room of the Longhorn Saloon playing cards with men he was supposed to be watching. Benjamin Monroe did not care about any of that. He was passing through. He was, in the private accounting of his own life, always passing through. He stabled Cinder at the livery on the south end of Commerce Street, paid the boy there 2 bits for a full feed of oats and a brushing, and walked up the plank boardwalk toward the Cattleman's Hotel because he wanted a bed that was not the ground and a meal that was not his own poor cooking. He had been trailing cattle north for a rancher named Hargrove out of Texas, and the drive had finished 3 days south of Caldwell when Hargrove had paid off all the hands and dissolved the outfit. Benjamin had ridden north alone out of no particular reason, only that north was a direction, and he had no better one. He was nearly at the hotel door when he heard the argument. It was coming from the alley between the hotel and the land office next door, and though Benjamin Monroe was not a man who involved himself in other people's trouble, something in the timbre of one of the voices stopped him on the boardwalk with his hand not quite on the door handle. One voice was a man's, low and blunt, and carrying the particular flatness of someone accustomed to being answered. The other voice was a woman's, and it was not frightened. That was the thing that made him stop. He had expected fear, and instead he heard something firm, something that had decided it would not bend, and that quality in a voice was rare enough that he turned toward it before he had made any decision to do so. He came around the corner of the hotel and stopped. The woman was standing with her back very straight against the wall of the land office, and the man in front of her was a heavy-set fellow in a good coat with a silver watch chain looped across his vest. He was not touching her, but he was standing close enough that the not touching had a threatening quality to it, as if he had chosen the distance deliberately. "You will not walk into that land office tomorrow and file that claim," the heavy-set man was saying. "I am telling you, Miss Gentry, as plainly as I know how to tell you, walk away from this. Take whatever alderman offered you for the house and go back to wherever you came from." "I came from right here," the woman said, and her voice was so steady it was almost eerie. "I came from this town, and that claim was my father's, and it is mine now, and I will file it tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and you will not be in my way." The heavy-set man made a sound that was more dismissal than laugh. "You are making a serious mistake. A woman alone." "I am going inside now," she said, cutting him off. "Good evening, Mr. Crail." She moved to step around him, and the man's hand went out and closed around her arm, and that was the moment Benjamin Monroe stepped fully into the alley. "Let her go," he said. He said it quietly. He did not reach for the Colt. He did not need to. There was something in the way he said it and possibly something in the way he looked that carried its own persuasion. The man called Crail turned his head and assessed Benjamin in the way that men like Crail always assessed men who challenged them, calculating advantage and finding, apparently, that the numbers did not favor him. He released the woman's arm. "This is not your business," Crail said. "It is now," Benjamin said, still quiet. Crail straightened his coat and walked past Benjamin without another word, and his boots on the packed earth of the alley were the only sound until he turned onto the boardwalk and was gone. The woman stood for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the wall of the land office and her breathing carefully controlled. Then she looked at Benjamin Monroe and he looked at her, and that was the first time in 8 years that he forgot, for a brief and terrible moment, where he was going. She was 26 years old, though he did not know that yet. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up under a practical hat, and eyes that were the specific green of a river in shadow. She was wearing a traveling dress that had been mended at the cuffs and a pair of boots that were good quality and very worn, which told him something about her circumstances even before she spoke. Her face was fine-boned and serious, and there was something in the set of her mouth that said she had been carrying a weight for a long time and had stopped expecting anyone to notice. "Thank you," she said. She said it like a woman who did not say it easily. "He is gone," Benjamin said. "That is the whole of it." He touched his hat and turned to leave, and she said, "He will come back." Benjamin stopped. "Not tonight," she said, "but tomorrow, or the night before I file. He has done this before, you see. This is the 4th time he has put himself in my way." He turned back. "Who is Crail?" "Harlan Crail. He owns the Crail Land and Cattle Company. He has been trying to acquire my father's land claim for 2 years, and when my father died last spring and I came back to file the inheritance, he redoubled his efforts." She paused, and something moved through her expression that was not quite bitterness and not quite grief, but some combination of both. "He believes that a woman alone has no recourse." "Do you," Benjamin said, "have recourse?" She looked at him for a moment as if she was weighing something. "I have a lawyer in Wichita who says the claim is valid. I have my father's papers. I have tomorrow morning." She let out a breath that was not quite a sigh. "And as of approximately 3 minutes ago, I appear to have you." Benjamin Monroe felt something shift slightly in the night air, or possibly in himself, and he was not entirely sure which. "I'm just passing through," he said. It was the truest thing he knew about himself. "I know," she said. "I could see that." She looked at him steadily. "I am Lavinia Gentry. I do not need you to fight anyone. I do not need you to solve anything. I only need," she paused, and something in her face became very careful. "I only need someone to walk with me to that land office tomorrow morning. That is all, just someone beside me so that Crail cannot get me alone again." It was such a small thing. Benjamin knew it was a small thing. He also knew, with the certainty of a man who has lived entirely on the interior for 8 years, that small things have a way of becoming everything. "I do not make promises," he said. It was not a refusal. It was a warning, offered honestly. Lavinia Gentry looked at him with those river shadow eyes and said, "I am not asking you for a promise. I am asking you to walk beside me tomorrow morning." That is a fact, not a vow. And Benjamin Monroe, for reasons he did not fully understand and would not have been able to articulate if pressed, said, "I will be there." It was the first promise he had made to any living soul in 8 years, and he made it in an alley in Caldwell, Kansas, to a woman he had known for 7 minutes, and the moment the words left his mouth he felt something in his chest that he had thought was dead shift and breathed like an ember in cold ash. He had supper alone at the hotel dining room, and then lay awake in the narrow bed of his rented room, and thought about the last time he had made a promise. That had been 8 years ago, in 1871, to a woman named Clara who he had intended to marry, in a town in Missouri that he no longer visited in his memory if he could help it. He had promised her he would come back from a cattle drive solvent and ready to build a life. He had come back and found the cholera had come first. The epidemic had moved through that county like a fire through dry grass. Clara was gone, and her mother, and the youngest of her brothers, and 3 other families Benjamin had known since boyhood. And afterward the Missouri town had felt so full of absence that he had not been able to breathe inside it. He had ridden west and kept riding, and somewhere in the vast open country between Missouri and the Llano Estacado, he had quietly decided that a man who made promises was a man who gave the world a handle to break him with, and that he had been broken quite enough. He lay in the hotel bed and listened to the noise of Caldwell below his window, and he wondered what he had done. In the morning, he was at the land office at 8:15, standing in the thin autumn sunlight with his hat in his hands, because it seemed like the right thing to do in a situation that called for some semblance of dignity. Lavinia Gentry arrived at 8:20 with a leather satchel under her arm and her hair done up very neatly, and that same straight back that he had noticed the night before. She stopped when she saw him, and something moved quickly through her face. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said. She looked at him for a moment as if that were a remarkable thing, and then she looked away and down the street as if checking it, and Benjamin saw then that she had not entirely believed he would come. She had not been sure. She had asked a stranger for the smallest possible thing, and she had not been sure he would give it, and that told him something about the 8 months she had spent in this town trying to hold her father's claim against Harlan Crail and his money and his certainty. "He is not here yet," she said. "No," Benjamin said. They went into the land office together. The clerk inside was a young man with ink-stained fingers who looked up when they came in and then looked quickly back down at his ledger. Benjamin Monroe stood to the side while Lavinia Gentry spread her papers on the counter with the precise movements of someone who has rehearsed this, and she stated her business clearly and completely, and the clerk processed her claim with a quietness that suggested he had been instructed, at some point, to make difficulties. There were no difficulties now. Benjamin stood 6 feet away with his arms loose at his sides and said nothing, and did nothing, and the clerk processed the claim. When it was done, Lavinia gathered her papers back into the satchel and turned from the counter, and her face in that moment was something Benjamin Monroe had not seen in a long time. It was relief, pure and complete, the face of a person who has been holding their breath for months and finally breathed. They came out onto the boardwalk and Harlan Crail was there. He was not alone. He had 2 men with him, both with the look of hired muscle rather than working cowboys, and he was standing at the foot of the land office steps with his watch chain catching the morning light. He looked at Lavinia and then at Benjamin and then back at Lavinia. "It will not hold," Crail said. "A woman cannot hold property in this territory without a male relative to co-sign. My lawyer in Wichita says otherwise," Lavinia said. "Kansas law does not require it." "Kansas law," Crail said, and made it sound like a reference to something provincial and unimportant. "Miss Gentry, you are not making friends in this town." "I did not come here for friends," Lavinia said. "I came for what is mine." Crail's eyes moved to Benjamin. "And who are you exactly?" "Nobody in particular," Benjamin said. "He is with me," Lavinia said. And there was something in the way she said it that was not romantic and was not legal and was something else entirely, a declaration of the simplest kind, and Benjamin felt it settle over him like a coat. Crail looked at him for a long moment and then apparently decided that the morning had not gone his way and that pressing the point in public, on the steps of the land office, with a filed claim fresh in the clerk's ledger, was not the wisest next move. He turned and walked away, and his 2 men followed him, and the street returned to its ordinary morning business. Lavinia let out a breath. "Thank you," she said again. "You can go now. I know you said you were passing through." Benjamin looked at her. The morning light was on her face, and she was not looking at him. She was watching the street where Crail had gone, and her jaw was set in a way that told him she was already calculating what Crail would do next. She was not a woman who stopped. He understood that about her in the way you understand a thing about a landscape when you have lived in open country long enough, not by looking at the thing directly but by reading everything around it. "Where is this land?" he said. She turned to look at him. "I beg your pardon. Your father's claim, the land you just filed on, where is it?" 7 miles southwest of town, she said, along Bluff Creek. 160 acres and a house and a barn that need considerable work. Benjamin nodded slowly. And you are going to go out there, alone. I have been living out there for 2 weeks already, she said, and her chin came up slightly the way it did when she was not going to apologize for something. I came back to town to file the claim. Now I will go back to the land. Alone, he said again. Mister, she stopped. I do not know your name. Monroe, he said. Benjamin Monroe. Mr. Monroe, she said carefully. I do not require. I am not offering to fix your problems, he said. I am asking where your land is because I need work. The drive I came up on finished 3 days south of here, and I have got no employment and no particular direction. Do you need a hand? Lavinia Gentry looked at him for a long, still moment, and something in her face did a very careful thing, opening and then pulling back and then opening again like a door in wind. The claim is disputed, she said. If you work on it, Crail may make trouble for you specifically. Crail, Benjamin said, does not much frighten me. Another pause. I cannot pay much. I have my father's savings, but they will not stretch far. I do not need much, he said, and that was true. He had been paying himself in dust and distance for 8 years and had come to find that he needed very little. She looked at him the way she had looked at him the night before, weighing something with great seriousness. And then she said, Can you fix a roof? Yes, he said. The house roof is letting in water on the north side. My father's tools are there. I have a garden that needs turning for winter and fence posts that need setting along the east pasture. She paused. It is hard work, and the accommodations are a small bunkhouse that is cleaner than it looks. Miss Gentry, Benjamin said, I have slept in worse situations than a bunkhouse in 4 out of the last 5 winters. When do you leave? And that was how Benjamin Monroe, who was always passing through, stopped passing through. They rode out of Caldwell in the mid-morning with their horses side by side, and the Kansas prairie opening around them like something exhaling. The sky was the deep clear blue of late October, and the grass was going gold and bronze in all directions. And there were cattle on the distant hills that belonged to someone, and hawks riding the thermals over the creek line. And the day had the quality of a day that does not know it is important. Lavinia rode a good sorrel gelding named Cedar, and she rode well, in the no-nonsense way of someone who had grown up on horseback rather than learning it as an accomplishment. She did not talk a great deal as they rode, and Benjamin appreciated that. He had been in the company of people who filled silence because they were afraid of it, and silence with those people was exhausting. Lavinia's silence was different. It was the silence of someone who was thinking, and who did not feel the need to share every thought as it occurred, and riding beside that kind of silence was restful in a way he had not expected. How long were you away from Caldwell? He asked, at some point in the first mile. 6 years, she said. I went to Wichita when I was 20. My mother's sister lived there. My father worked the claim alone after I left. She paused. He wrote to me every month. I wrote back. He said the claim was doing well enough, but he never said anything about Crail until the last letter, and by the time that letter reached me, he was gone. Gone how? Benjamin said. Hart, she said. Quick, the neighbor woman who found him said. He had just come in from the field, and he sat down in his chair and did not get up again. She said he looked peaceful. Her voice was very steady. I came out as soon as I could. There was his estate to settle, the letter to the lawyer in Wichita, all the papers to find. And then Crail appeared at the door 3 days after I arrived with an offer to buy the claim for $800, and when I refused him, he changed his approach. To obstruction, Benjamin said. Precisely. She glanced at him. You understand this kind of man. I have seen this kind of man, he said. They are particular to regions where the law is thin. Kansas is not entirely lawless, she said. No, he agreed, but it is thin in the places where money has not decided to be interested yet. She considered that. Your analysis of frontier law is more sophisticated than I expected from someone who described themselves as nobody in particular. I read, he said. Something shifted in her face. What do you read? Whatever I can get, he said. History, Philosophy where I can find it. I had a run of Montaigne's essays for a winter in New Mexico, and I thought at the time that it might be the best winter of my life." Lavinia Gentry looked at him then with something new in her expression, something that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but was in the neighborhood of both. "I had Montaigne," she said. "My mother's copy. I read it until the binding gave." Benjamin did not say anything to that, but something happened in his chest that he elected not to examine closely. The Gentry claim sat in a bend of Bluff Creek, where the water had carved a natural windbreak on the west side of the land. The house was a solid structure of limestone and wood, single-story with a covered porch, built by Lavinia's father over several years, and showing the care of something made to last. The barn was good-sized and in better repair than the house. There was a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that had gone to seed and frost-dead vegetation, and a root cellar that Lavinia opened for him to show that her father had put up a reasonable store of supplies before he died. "He was a careful man," Benjamin said. "Very," Lavinia said, and the word had grief in it, small and controlled. The bunkhouse was a one-room structure behind the barn with a cot and a small stove and a shelf of tools and a window that looked east. It was, as Lavinia had said, clean. It smelled of old wood and a little of dust, and Benjamin stood in it for a moment and felt something in its plainness that suited him. "It will do fine," he said. She showed him the fence posts that needed setting, the north side of the roof where two boards had warped and split, the vegetable beds that needed turning under before the first hard freeze, and the water trough by the barn that had developed a slow seep along one seam. She showed him these things with the thorough efficiency of someone making a business arrangement, which it was, and Benjamin listened and asked practical questions about what tools were where, and where the closest lumber could be sourced, and whether she had lime for the roof seam. And then she left him to settle in, and he stood in the bunkhouse doorway in the late afternoon light and looked at the land and thought, quietly and without alarm, that he had not been anywhere in 8 years that he had looked at and thought, "This is a place a person could be." He started with the roof the next morning. He was up before dawn by habit, made a small fire in the bunkhouse stove, had coffee, and the biscuits he had made from the supplies Lavinia had pointed out were available to him, and was on the ladder with a pry bar by the time the sun cleared the horizon. The work was straightforward and satisfying in the way that physical repair is satisfying, the clear problem and the solvable solution, and he worked steadily through the morning. Lavinia came out with coffee at mid-morning, standing at the base of the ladder and looking up at him with the direct gaze that he was coming to understand was simply how she looked at things. "It is worse than it appeared from below," she said. "Yes," he said, "but not as bad as it could be. 2 new boards will do it. The framing is sound." "My father built the framing," she said. "He knew what he was doing," Benjamin said. She handed the coffee up and he descended halfway to take it, and they stood there for a moment in the cool morning air with the creek audible somewhere through the willows and the cattle hawk describing a long circle above the south pasture. "Do you have family?" she asked. It was a practical question, not a personal one, in the same tone she asked about lumber and lime. "Not anymore," he said. "My parents are gone. I have a brother in Ohio who I write to occasionally." "What does he do?" "He is a school teacher," Benjamin said. "He married a woman from Cincinnati and they have 3 children and a house with glass windows on 2 sides. Do you miss him?" "Yes," Benjamin said, and was surprised to find he meant it, having not thought about it in some time. "Yes, I do. I have no siblings," Lavinia said. "It was always just my father and my mother and me, and then just my father and me," and then she stopped. "And then just me." The morning sat quiet around them. "How old were you when your mother died?" he asked. 14, she said. "Fever in the winter of 1867. "I am sorry," he said, and meant that too. She looked at the horizon with those steady green eyes. She was the kind of woman who made a room different just by being in it, not loudly. She was not loud, but the room knew she was there. She paused. "I have spent considerable time trying to understand how a person does that. "I think you may already know," Benjamin said, and then he was surprised at himself for saying it and climbed back up the ladder before she could respond. He heard her walk back toward the house, and he kept working, and the morning went on around him, and Benjamin Monroe hammered new boards into a sound roof in Kansas, and felt the particular unease of a man who has kept himself carefully numb, beginning to notice that something is happening under the surface of him. The days fell into a pattern that had the naturalness of things that are right. Benjamin rose early and worked until noon, and Lavinia made dinner at midday because her father had always done it that way and she had kept the habit, and they ate at the kitchen table with the autumn light coming through the window, and they talked. That was the thing that surprised him most. They talked easily, in the way of people who have found the same frequency without having to search for it. He told her about the cattle drive south of Caldwell, about Texas and the Llano Estacado, about the winter with Montaigne in New Mexico. She told him about Wichita, about her aunt's house and the people she had known there, about the law cases she had read about in the newspapers regarding women's property rights in Kansas, which were better than most states but still full of gaps that men like Crail knew how to find. "The legislature passed the Married Women's Act in 1868, she said one afternoon over dinner, "which helps, but my claim is in my own name, which is different, and the interpretations vary by county." "Your lawyer in Wichita is confident?" Benjamin asked. "He says the filing is solid," she said. "He says Crail would have to challenge it in district court and that the cost and publicity would not serve Crail's interests, but," she set her fork down, "but men like Crail do not always calculate cost and publicity rationally. Sometimes they calculate on pride, and pride is its own kind of accounting." "Yes," Benjamin said. She looked at him. "You know something about that." It was not a question exactly. "I have made some bad decisions on account of pride," he said carefully. "Have you?" she said. He did not elaborate and she did not press it, and the conversation moved elsewhere, and this was another thing he appreciated about Lavinia Gentry. She had a sense of where the walls were, and she did not push against them. She was direct about facts and reserved about the private territories of other people's lives, and these qualities together made her the most comfortable person he had been near in a very long time. In the afternoons he worked on the fence posts. The east pasture needed 40 feet of new line, and it was hard work in the clay soil, digging post holes with a bar, and then setting the posts straight and tamping them solid. And by evening his shoulders ached in a way that was satisfying, because it was the ache of having done something real. He liked working on her land. He noticed that he liked it in a way that was different from the liking of a man who is satisfied with his labor and nothing more. It had something personal in it. When he set a post straight and solid, he found himself thinking about the coming spring, about what would grow in those fields, and about who would see it, and those were not thoughts a passing-through man was supposed to be thinking. At the end of the first week, on a Friday evening, Lavinia made a proper supper of beef stew with the last of the kitchen garden carrots and cornbread from the sack of meal in the root cellar, and she asked him to eat it at the house table rather than the bunkhouse because, she said, it seemed wasteful for two people to eat in separate buildings when they were the only two people on 160 acres. Benjamin Monroe sat at the kitchen table of the Gentry house in the lamplight and ate beef stew, and thought about the very specific and particular pleasure of being warm and fed in a room with someone who did not require anything from you that you could not give. "Tell me about the 8 years," Lavinia said. He looked up from his bowl. "Not personally," she said quickly. "I do not mean your private life. I mean the geography. Where have you been?" And he told her because it was not the private thing, it was only the physical catalog of his wandering. Missouri to Kansas, Kansas to Colorado in the mining country, a year with a freighting outfit. Colorado down to New Mexico, 2 winters, a spell as a line rider for a small ranching operation outside Santa Fe. East Texas on a cattle outfit, then north with the drive to Dodge City the year before, and another drive this year to Caldwell. Kansas again. "You have been going in a very large circle," she said. "I have," he said, and there was something almost humorous in it for the first time, looking at it from the outside, from the vantage of her observation. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "I have not known," he said honestly. "I have kept moving because stopping required knowing where to stop, and I have not known where that was." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The lamp between them made a pool of warm light on the table, the kind of light that makes people tell the truth. "And now," she said. "I do not know," he said. And then, because honesty seemed to be the currency of this particular kitchen, something about this place does not feel like passing through. Lavinia looked at him for a moment and then looked at her coffee cup. "Mr. Monroe," she said carefully, "I should tell you something." "Benjamin," he said. "You can call me Benjamin." "Benjamin," she said, and the word had a thoughtfulness to it, as if she were testing its weight. "This situation is not uncomplicated. I have a disputed land claim, and a man who wants to take it from me, and no male relative in this territory, and a lawyer 70 miles away. I cannot—" She stopped and started again. "I cannot afford to confuse gratitude with something else." "I am not confused," he said. She looked at him. "I know what gratitude looks like," he said. "I have received it and I have felt it. What is happening here is different. I am saying that as a fact, not as a request." A long pause. Outside, the wind was moving through the willows by the creek. "I am not good at this," she said. At letting people in. I have lived alone for a long time, inside of myself, I mean, even when I was surrounded by people. My aunt's house was full of people, and I was alone in a room inside my own head the entire 6 years. "I know that room," he said. Her eyes moved to his face. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think you do." They sat in the lamplight for a while longer without speaking, and then Lavinia said it was getting late, and he said good night and walked back to the bunkhouse in the cold and the stars. And he lay down on the cot and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in 8 years, like himself. Not the worn-down traveling version of himself, not the man who kept moving to keep from feeling, but the actual core of the man he had been before Missouri, before loss, before the long, deliberate numbness. He felt like Benjamin Monroe, who had once been willing to love things and had stopped, and who was now, apparently, starting again. He tried to tell himself it was too soon and too complicated and he was passing through. He did not believe himself. 2 weeks into his time at the Gentry claim, Harlan Crail made his next move. It was not physical, because Crail was not ultimately a physical kind of man. He was a paperwork kind of man. He sent a letter through his own lawyer to the land office in Caldwell, claiming that the Gentry filing was invalid on the grounds that the original claim, filed by Lavinia's father in 1871, had lapsed during a period of non-occupancy, specifically the years when Lavinia had been in Wichita and her father had been the sole occupant. This was a technical argument and a weak one, but it was enough to put a temporary dispute notation in the land office ledger, which meant Lavinia could not sell or mortgage or legally improve the property until the dispute was resolved. She read the letter at the kitchen table with Benjamin sitting across from her, and her face went through several things very quickly. "He is trying to freeze me out," she said. "If I cannot legally improve the property, I cannot put in the improvements I need to survive the winter. And if I cannot mortgage it, I cannot get the money for supplies. And if I cannot get the money for supplies—" "We survive the winter on what is here," Benjamin said. She looked at him. "The freeze on improvements is broadly interpreted. It could mean, I am not legally improving anything," he said. "I am repairing existing structures and maintaining existing fence lines. That is maintenance, not improvement, and it falls under a different provision." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I read," he said, "including the Kansas statutes I found at the hotel in Caldwell when I was waiting for supper on the evening I arrived." Her expression did something complicated. "You read the Kansas statutes for entertainment." "I read whatever is available," he said. "And in towns like Caldwell, sometimes it is the land statutes." She looked at the letter for a moment and then at him. The winter supplies problem is real, she said. I have enough in the root cellar to last 2 people through January, possibly into February, but the rest. What did you plan before I was here? He asked. I planned to sell off some of the cattle on the north pasture, she said. There are 12 head that were my father's. The dispute notation will complicate a sale if Crail presses the interpretation to include livestock. Can your lawyer challenge the notation? Yes, but it will take time. District court, he said, could be months. Benjamin thought about this. Crail's goal is to make you give up before the court rules. Yes, she said. Can he succeed? She looked at him for a long time. Not if I have reason to stay, she said, and it was carefully worded, but it landed in the room between them with a precision that they both felt. Then you have reason to stay, he said. I am staying. Lavinia looked at him, and her eyes were very clear and very green, and something in them that had been held back for a long time shifted and was not held back anymore. Benjamin, she said carefully. You said yourself you are not a man who makes promises. I said I was not a man who made promises, he said. That is past tense. She looked at him for a very long moment, and then she said, simply and without drama, all right. And that was the beginning of it, or rather it was the naming of something that had already begun, and the naming of it made it real in the way that all named things become real. The next weeks were full of work and full of each other. Benjamin rode into Caldwell for lumber and supplies and negotiated with the mercantile owner, a man named Potts who was Crail adjacent but not Crail committed, for a credit arrangement against the cattle he was confident would eventually sell. Potts, assessing Benjamin Monroe in the careful way that mercantile owners assess men who want credit, agreed to a modest arrangement. Benjamin came back with enough lumber and lime and dry goods to make the winter viable. He fixed the roof properly this time, all of it, not just the north side. He dug out the water trough seam and resealed it with a river clay mixture that would hold. He set the fence posts and strung the new line, and then, because he was there and the work was in front of him, he spent 3 days rebuilding the front porch steps and the porch railing, which had gone soft with rot. Lavinia worked beside him when her own work was done, and her work was considerable. She managed the cattle, fed and watered them, checked the fence lines from horseback each morning. She cooked and preserved what the kitchen garden had left to give before the hard frost, and organized the root cellar with a precision that spoke of genuine skill at domestic management. She mended the barn roof where the shingles had shifted. She was not a woman who waited for someone else to handle things, but she was also not a woman who refused help, and that was the distinction that mattered. They fell into a rhythm that had its own music, the kind of rhythm that couples develop over years, but that they seemed to find in weeks, because they were both people who had been alone long enough to recognize the sound of not being alone when they heard it. In the evenings, they read. Lavinia had her father's small library, solid and practical, farm almanacs and a Bible, and a history of the American West published in 1872, and one surprising volume of poetry by Alfred Lord Tennyson that she said her mother had sent for from St. Louis, and that she had never been entirely sure her father had opened, but had kept because it was her mother's. Benjamin read the Tennyson and then handed it back to her, and she read from it aloud sometimes, in the evenings in the lamplight, and Benjamin Monroe sat in a chair in the kitchen of the Gentry house and listened to Lavinia's voice reading Tennyson and felt his chest ache in a way that was not grief and was not quite yet joy but was the country between them. One evening she read to him from the Lotus Eaters and stopped in the middle of a line and said, "Is this what you were doing? All those years?" He looked up. "Forgetting, wandering and forgetting," she said, "looking for somewhere that made you want to stop." He was quiet for a moment. "I think so," he said. "I did not know it was what I was doing, but yes, something like that." "What made you stop?" she asked, and then quickly, before he could answer, "You do not have to tell me." "I lost someone," he said. It was the first time he had said it plainly, without surrounding it in distance or omission. 8 years ago, I was going to marry her. She died in an epidemic, and afterward I could not stand to be in a place where I had intended to build something. Every time I looked at the ground, it was full of what was going to be there and wasn't. Lavinia sat with the Tennyson in her hands and said nothing for a moment. "And now," she said. "When I look at this ground," he said carefully, "I see what is here." She looked at him with the lamplight in her eyes and said nothing for a very long time, and then she said softly, "Her name." "Clara," he said. "She would have wanted you to stop wandering eventually," Lavinia said. "Yes," he said, "she would have. She was practical about happiness." He paused. "As are you." "I do not know if practical is the right word," Lavinia said. "Unsentimental about what is real," he said. "You do not waste grief on things that might not happen. You are present with what is in front of you." She looked at the book in her hands. "I learned that from watching what happens when you are not," she said. "My father spent the last years after my mother died in a kind of gentle absence. He was there, he worked, he was not a broken man, but he was," she paused. "Some part of him was with her and not here. And I thought that there is a way of grieving that is loyal to the dead but disloyal to the living, including to yourself. I decided I would not do it." "You are wiser than most," Benjamin said. "I am not wise," she said. "I am simply determined." He smiled at that, and she saw him smile, and something shifted in her face that was not quite a smile, but was the inside of one, the warmth before the expression, and he thought that was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. In the third week of November, with the first proper frost turning the grass white each morning, Harlan Crail appeared at the gate of the Gentry claim on horseback with his 2 hired men behind him. Benjamin saw them from the barn roof where he was checking shingles and came down the ladder without hurrying. Lavinia came out of the house with a shawl around her shoulders and stood on the repaired porch and watched Crail ride up to the gate and stop. "Miss Gentry," Crail said, "I have come to make you a final offer. $1,500 for the claim, the house, the barn, and the livestock. That is twice what I offered in the spring." "No," Lavinia said. Crail looked past her to Benjamin, standing beside the barn with his thumbs in his belt. "Monroe," he said, "you have been here long enough to know this situation is not going to resolve in her favor. The district court takes months, as her lawyer will tell her, and by spring she will have burned through her resources, and—" "My resources are my business," Lavinia said. "Good day, Mr. Crail. You are being stubborn, and it will cost you. I will ask you to leave my land now," she said, and her voice was so steady and so absolute that even Crail's hired men shifted slightly in their saddles. Crail looked at her and then at Benjamin, and then he said, "When this is finished, I will remember who stood on which side of it." And he turned his horse and rode back out through the gate, and his men went with him. Benjamin walked to the gate and closed it and looked at Lavinia on the porch. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she was watching Crail's dust settle in the lane, and then she looked at Benjamin, and he walked back to the porch and up the steps and stood close to her. "He will not win," she said. It was not bravado. She said it like a fact she had checked against the evidence and confirmed. "No," Benjamin said. She looked at him and then looked at the frost-white prairie, and then, with a decision so small it was almost invisible, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold from the morning air, cold and strong, and she held his hand and looked at the land. He did not say anything. He held her hand, and they stood on the porch and looked at the land together, and the creek moved in the willows, and the hawk was there again on the thermal above the south pasture, and the moment had a completeness to it that Benjamin Monroe had not felt in 8 years and had begun to believe he would not feel again. They did not discuss it. They did not name it. They went back to work. But in the evenings after that, when they sat by the stove or at the kitchen table, the distance between their chairs was different. Not closer physically, but different in the quality of the space between them, like the way a room sounds different when the windows are shut against the cold, more contained and more real. One evening in late November, he came into the kitchen from the barn where he had been sorting and mending tack, and Lavinia was at the stove and had cut her hand on the lid of the preserves jar, and was pressing a cloth to it with the same deliberate calm she brought to everything. And Benjamin took her hand in both of his and looked at the cut and said, "Sit down." And she sat down, and he cleaned the cut with the carbolic from the medical kit in the barn, and wrapped it neatly with a strip of clean cloth. And when he was done, her hand was still in his, and they were both looking at it. And he turned her hand over and held it palm up in both of his, and looked at it the way you look at something you have been trying not to know you want. "Benjamin," she said softly. He looked up. She was watching him with those river shadow eyes, and her face was open in a way he had not seen it fully open before, all the carefulness and the calculation set aside, and what was underneath was not fragile. It was very strong and very still, and it was looking at him directly and completely. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, above the bandage, and held them there for a moment, and she made a sound that was not quite a breath and not quite a word. "I think," he said, his voice low, "that I have been heading toward this kitchen my entire life and did not know it." She reached up with her other hand and touched his face, her thumb along his jaw, and said, "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard, and I want you to know I am keeping it." He laughed then, a real laugh, the kind he had almost forgotten he was capable of, and she laughed with him, and the kitchen was warm and the wind was in the willows, and outside the stars were hard and brilliant in the winter sky. He kissed her that night, properly and with all the intention that had been building for weeks, and she kissed him back with the same seriousness she brought to everything, and it was nothing like passing through. December came in cold and blue, and Benjamin Monroe spent it working on the Gentry claim, and eating at the Gentry table and sitting in the evenings with Lavinia in the warm kitchen. And he wrote to his brother in Ohio, the first long letter he had written in years, and told James Monroe that he had found a place that felt like the place he had been looking for, and that there was a woman, and that the woman was remarkable, and that he was not leaving. James wrote back in January, a letter that arrived in Caldwell on a day of sleet and gray sky, and that Benjamin brought out to the claim and read aloud to Lavinia, because she said she wanted to know if James Monroe was a good man. James was a good man. He wrote that he was glad and that Clara would be glad too, and that it was long past time, and would Benjamin please bring this remarkable woman to Ohio one day so the family could meet her. Lavinia listened to the whole letter with her hands folded on the table, and when he finished reading, she said that she thought she would like James Monroe very much. The dispute notation on the land claim was resolved in February 1880. Lavinia's lawyer in Wichita filed the district court challenge in early December, and the district judge, a man named Harcourt, who was neither Crail's man nor anyone else's man, but simply a judge who read the law and applied it, ruled in Lavinia's favor in early February after a hearing that took one morning, and included the testimony of the land office clerk and the original 1871 filing documents that Lavinia had kept in the leather satchel all those months. Harcourt ruled that the lapse argument was without merit under Kansas statute, that the claim was valid, and that all dispute notations were to be removed from the ledger. Crail did not appeal. The cost-benefit calculation, apparently, had finally resolved itself against him, and he turned his attention to other acquisitions, and the Gentry claim became, entirely and legally, Lavinia Gentry's land. She came back from Caldwell on the afternoon. The ruling was delivered, and Benjamin was in the barn when he heard Cedar in the lane, and he came out, and she rode through the gate and swung down and said nothing, only held up the paper from the court, and he read it standing in the lane with the February wind cold on his face. And when he looked up, she was watching him with a brightness in her face that was the most purely happy he had ever seen her. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She walked to him, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and he felt her breathe, deep and long and final, the breath of someone who has been holding it for a very long time. "I could not have done it," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Without you." "You could have," he said, because he believed it, "but I am glad you did not have to." She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and she was not a woman who cried easily or often, and she did not cry now, but the brightness in her eyes was its own kind of fullness. "Benjamin," she said, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I think you should know," she said very carefully, "that when you walked into that alley in October, I thought you were just a man who was passing through. And I told myself that throughout the whole of October and November and December, and I kept telling myself that right up until the night you held my hand on the porch, and I stopped believing it. And then I told myself not to say anything because the land dispute was unresolved, and I could not afford to be wrong about you." "Are you wrong about me?" he said. "No," she said, "I do not think I am." "You are not," he said. "Then I would like—" She stopped and started again. "I am going to say a very straightforward thing, and I need you to receive it in the spirit it is offered." "I will," he said. "I am in love with you," she said. "I have been for some time. I am saying it now because the land is mine and the dispute is done, and I do not have any more reasons to wait." Benjamin Monroe looked at Lavinia Gentry in the February wind in the lane of her claim, and felt every one of the 8 years of careful numbness dissolve like frost in noon sun. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the morning you walked up to that land office with your papers under your arm, and you were not afraid." "I was afraid," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why it was remarkable." She laughed, and he kissed her in the lane with the wind in the willows and cedar standing patiently nearby, and the whole of the Kansas winter spread blue and cold and brilliant around them. And it was the most alive Benjamin Monroe had felt since 1871, and he did not for 1 second take that for granted. The spring came in with mud and thaw, and the creek running high, and the grass returning green and new across the south pasture, and the Gentry claim came alive with the season in a way that Lavinia said her father had always loved about this land. The way it went from bare and brown to green so fast you could almost watch it happen. Benjamin stayed. He worked the land with her, and they planned together which fields to put into production, which sections of fence to extend, whether they could manage a small kitchen crop for market sale in Caldwell in addition to the cattle. He built a proper wood box for the porch and repaired the cellar stairs, and constructed a new chicken coop on the south side of the barn, because Lavinia had said she wanted chickens, and he saw no reason she should not have them. He went into Caldwell one afternoon in late March, and came back with a crate of young hens from the mercantile, and Lavinia stood in the yard, and laughed at him trying to manage 6 indignant chickens toward their new coop, which was the most undignified he had ever allowed himself to be in front of another person, and found that he did not mind at all. In April, Benjamin rode to Caldwell again, alone this time, and he was gone for 2 hours and came back with a small box from the jeweler that had opened on Commerce Street in the fall. The jeweler was a man from St. Louis named Fett, who had come west with his wife on the supposition that frontier towns needed jewelry as much as they needed saloons, and he was, it turned out, entirely right. Benjamin had the ring made from a design he described to Fett from memory, a simple gold band with a single small garnet, because Lavinia's eyes were green but garnets were what Fett had in stock, and they had a warmth to them that seemed right. He did not make an occasion of it. He did not wait for a particular evening or set a particular scene. He proposed to Lavinia Gentry on an April afternoon while they were mending fence along the east pasture line, both of them with their sleeves rolled up and the spring sun warm on their backs in cedar and cinder-cropping grass nearby. He was holding a section of wire and she was driving a staple, and he said, "Lavinia." She said, "What?" he said. "I would like you to marry me." She straightened up from the fence post and looked at him with the staple hammer still in her hand and her hair coming loose from its pin on the right side, and she looked at him for a moment with the full force of those green eyes, and then she said, "Yes, obviously yes. I have been waiting for you to ask since January." He produced the box from his coat pocket, and she looked at it and then at him and then opened it and looked at the garnet ring and said, "Benjamin Monroe, you went to a jeweler." "I did," he said. "You had this made," she said. "Fett was very accommodating," he said. She looked at the ring for a moment longer and then held out her left hand, and he put it on her finger, and she looked at it on her hand in the spring light. And then she put both arms around him and held on, and he held her back. And around them the prairie was loud with spring, birds and wind and the distant sound of the creek. And Benjamin Monroe stood in the middle of it and felt that he had at last arrived somewhere. They were married in June 1880 by the minister of the Caldwell church, the one with the mismatched boards in the east wall, because Lavinia said she wanted to be married in a real place that had survived things, not just a pretty place. The ceremony was small. Potts from the mercantile came with his wife, who had grown fond of Lavinia during the months of the land dispute. The land office clerk came, a little sheepish about the past but sincere in the present. A neighboring rancher named Ellis and his wife came, because they had been Thomas Gentry's nearest friends and Lavinia had known them since childhood. James Monroe came from Ohio. He arrived 2 days before the wedding on the Caldwell stage, a man slightly younger than Benjamin and considerably rounder, with spectacles and ink stains on his fingers from a lifetime of teaching, and a smile that made him look like someone who found the world largely delightful. He met Lavinia in the front parlor of the hotel and shook her hand and then looked at Benjamin and said, "Oh, she is absolutely remarkable." And Lavinia looked so perfectly pleased at this endorsement and so carefully restrained about showing it that Benjamin nearly laughed out loud. James told her, privately, the evening before the wedding, that Benjamin had been a different person after Clara died, not broken. Benjamin was too stubborn to break, but diminished, like a fire that had been banked so long it had forgotten how to be a fire. And he said that the letters Benjamin had written from Kansas, the November letter and the December letter and the long February letter after the court ruling, sounded like his brother again, sounded like the full version. And that was not a small thing, and she should know it was not. Lavinia told James that she intended to keep Benjamin Monroe from ever finding a reason to pass through anywhere again, and James said he believed she was equal to the task, and they understood each other perfectly. The wedding was on a Saturday in June when the prairie was green, and the sky was the full blue of summer, and Benjamin Monroe stood in the small church with the mismatched boards and watched Lavinia walk toward him in a dress of blue-gray that she had made herself and her hair down for the only time he had ever seen it, dark auburn and heavy on her shoulders. And she looked at him the whole way down the aisle with those river-shadow eyes, direct and clear and certain. And he felt his chest fill with something so large he thought it might not fit and found that it did. "I do," he said when the minister asked him. "I do," she said when the minister asked her. And then, because she was Lavinia, she said it again, quieter just for him. "I do." The summer of 1880 was good. They worked the land together through the long, warm days, and in the evenings they sat on the repaired porch and watched the sun go down over the Chicaskia River country to the west, and the nights were warm enough to leave the windows open, and the creek sounds came in with the dark. Benjamin Monroe had spent 8 years being surprised that the world went on, that mornings kept coming and the sun kept moving, and time did not particularly care that he had stepped out of it. Now he was surprised in a different direction. He was surprised at the richness of an ordinary day, the satisfaction of it, the way eating breakfast with Lavinia and working the land beside her, and hearing her voice in the evening was more sustaining than anything he had chased across Colorado or New Mexico or Texas. He wrote to James often. James wrote back, long letters full of the details of his children's lives, the 8-year-old who wanted to be a cavalry officer, and the 6-year-old who was already reading, and the 4-year-old who had no apparent ambitions, beyond acquiring more cookies. Benjamin read these letters aloud to Lavinia, and she listened with a warmth in her face that he recognized and was glad to see. In the fall of 1880, A year after he had ridden into Caldwell on a grella mare and walked into an alley and made the first promise he had made in 8 years, Lavinia told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast on a Tuesday morning in October, matter-of-factly, the way she told him most important things, without preamble or ceremony, because she trusted that the importance would be clear without either. She said, "I believe we are going to need the second bedroom properly furnished by spring." Benjamin looked at her across the breakfast table and understood what she was saying and felt the world tilt slightly on its axis in the very best possible way. "In the spring." He said, "March or April," she said. "I'm not entirely certain." He got up from the table and came around to her side and knelt beside her chair, which was not characteristic of him and surprised them both, and he took her hands and held them and said, "Lavinia." "You are going to make me cry," she said, very firmly, as if crying were something she had decided against. "You can cry," he said. "I will not tell anyone." She put her forehead down against his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the October kitchen with the stove warm and the window showing the bright fall sky. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Enormously," he said honestly, "and completely glad." "That is exactly the right answer," she said. He spent the winter building the second bedroom, properly this time, with care and detail. A good solid floor and walls that were smooth and a window that faced east so the morning light would come in first thing. He built a cradle from cedar wood he traded for at the lumber yard in Caldwell, a simple design with clean lines and solid joints, and he smoothed it with such thoroughness that there was not a rough edge anywhere on it. Lavinia watched him work on the cradle one evening in the lamplight of the new bedroom and said, "You are going to be a remarkable father." "I do not know that," he said, because he was honest about things he did not know. "I do," she said. He looked at her, sitting in the chair in the lamplight with the growing curve of her belly and the book of Tennyson in her lap that she had taken to reading again in the evenings, and thought that she was the most certain person he had ever known. Not certain the way people are certain when they have not considered the alternatives, but certain the way people are certain when they have considered everything and still arrived at yes. "I promised you I would stay," he said. "That first morning, when I said I would walk you to the land office, I made you a promise." "You said you did not make promises," she said. "I said that," he agreed. "And then I made one anyway, and then I kept it." "Yes," she said, "you did." "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "that I would like to keep making them, promises, specifically to you." She looked at him with those eyes that saw everything clearly and missed nothing. "What kind of promises?" she said. "Small ones mostly," he said. "The kind that are made and kept every day without anyone noticing them much. That I will be here in the morning, that the fire will be lit, that if something needs fixing I will fix it. That I will read whatever we can get our hands on and tell you what I think and listen to what you think. That I will not go." "That you will not go," she said softly. "That I will not go," he said. "That is the one that matters most." Lavinia closed the Tennyson and looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she said, "Benjamin Monroe, I am going to tell you something that I have been thinking about since October, since before I told you about the baby, since I have been lying awake at night thinking about this life we are building." "Tell me," he said. "You came into that alley," she said, "because you heard a voice that was not frightened. That is what you told me once indirectly. And I was not frightened because I had decided not to be frightened, because I had come so far and fought so long, and I was not going to let Crail or anyone else take from me the thing my father had made. And then you were there, and you were quiet, and you did not make it large or dramatic, you just stood there. And Crail left. And I thought, standing in that alley, that I had never met a man who understood exactly the right amount of space to take up." Benjamin said nothing. "You take up exactly the right amount of space," she said. "You always have. You came into my land and my kitchen and my life, and you took up exactly the right amount and not a breath more. And you fixed the roof and set the posts and built me a chicken coop and a second bedroom and a cradle for our child. And you read Montaigne and Tennyson and the Kansas statutes. And you made one promise in an alley, and you kept it every single day since. And I love you the way I love this land, which is completely and without reservation, and with no intention of ever changing my mind." The lamplight was between them, and outside the Kansas winter was quiet and cold, and the creek was frozen now, and the stars were very clear. And Benjamin Monroe looked at his wife, Lavinia Monroe, who had been Lavinia Gentry, who had stood in an alley and refused to be afraid, and felt the 8 years of wandering and silence and careful nothingness resolve into the simple and enormous fact of this moment, this room, this woman, this life that had been waiting for him to stop moving long enough to find it. "I love you," he said. He said it plainly, the way she said important things. "I know," she said, "I love you." Their son was born in the last week of March 1881, on a night of early spring rain that drummed on the good sound roof and filled the creek and turned the south pasture to mud. The neighbor woman, Mrs. Ellis, came out as midwife, and the birth was long and difficult, and Benjamin Monroe spent 8 hours pacing the length of the kitchen and the length of the porch in the rain and back again. And when Mrs. Ellis opened the bedroom door and said, "You have a son and your wife is well," he sat down on the kitchen floor, which was not characteristic of him, and put his face in his hands for a moment. The baby was small and red and furious about existence, and had a quality of determined loudness that Lavinia said she had no idea where it came from, and Benjamin said he had a theory. They named him Thomas James Monroe, Thomas for Lavinia's father and James for Benjamin's brother. And when Benjamin wrote to James in Ohio that night, an impractical, rain-smudged letter written at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning with the baby asleep in the cedar cradle in the new bedroom, and Lavinia sleeping with the heavy sleep of a woman who has done an enormous piece of work, he could not make the letter coherent, but James, reading it in Ohio, would later say he had never understood anything more completely in his life. Thomas Monroe grew through that first year with the vigor and stubbornness of a child who has inherited the better qualities of both his parents. He was opinionated from the beginning and physical, pulling himself to standing on the edge of the chair before he was 11 months old, and regarding the room with the particular expression of a person who is deciding what to do next and is confident about his ability to do it. Lavinia nursed him and talked to him throughout his days with the same directness she brought to everything, explaining to him what she was doing as she did it in the way that her father had explained things to her, the practical reality of the world presented without condescension. Benjamin read to him in the evenings, starting with things that were too old for him and not caring, because Thomas would not know the difference and the sound of it was the point. And by 2 years old, Thomas Monroe was sitting on his father's knee in the kitchen while Benjamin read aloud from whatever book they had, the Tennyson and the History of the American West, and eventually a copy of Robinson Crusoe that Benjamin had ordered through the mercantile, and which arrived, slightly battered, from a bookshop in Kansas City. The Gentry claim, which had become the Monroe claim with Lavinia's name on the deed, alongside her husband's as Kansas law by then allowed, grew in those years into something that had the solidity of a place that knows what it is. Benjamin extended the east pasture fence in 1882 and put a new section of land into wheat production that did well enough in the first year to justify a second section. Lavinia kept the cattle and expanded the kitchen garden, and began selling produce and preserves to the Caldwell mercantile on a small commercial basis that Potts referred to, with some admiration, as the best preserves west of Wichita. They added to the house in the spring of 1883, a proper extension on the west side with 2 more rooms, because the family had grown in December 1882 with the arrival of a daughter, Mary Clara Monroe, who was quieter than her brother had been, and whose eyes were the same specific green as her mother's, and who regarded the world from the beginning with a watchful intelligence that made Lavinia say, "She is going to be trouble in the very best way," and Benjamin say, "Yes, she is going to be you." The name Clara had been Lavinia's suggestion. She had said it simply one evening when they were discussing names that she thought perhaps Clara, and she had looked at him when she said it to see how he received it, and Benjamin had looked back at her and felt the old grief which was still there, not heavy any more but present, honored, and he had said, "Yes, Clara, that is right." She would be glad, Lavinia said. A person who was loved by you and loved you would want your life to be full. Yes, he said, she would. And so the daughter was Mary Clara Monroe, and she was very much herself from the beginning, and Lavinia was right that she would be trouble in the best way, and Benjamin was right that she was very much her mother. In the summer of 1883, James Monroe and his family came west from Ohio on the train to Wichita and rode out to Caldwell and arrived at the Monroe claim on a July afternoon in a hired wagon with 3 children and a considerable amount of luggage. Thomas Monroe, who was 2.5 and already very clear about his opinions, assessed his Ohio cousins with the seriousness of an experienced range inspector and then apparently approved, because within 20 minutes all 4 children were attempting to chase the chickens in the yard, and the noise level was remarkable. James and Benjamin sat on the repaired porch and watched the chaos, and James said, "This is what you wrote to me about. This." And he meant the whole of it, the land and the house and the chickens and the noise, and Lavinia in the doorway laughing at something the youngest Ohio cousin had done. "Yes," Benjamin said. "I am glad you rode into Caldwell," James said. "So am I," Benjamin said. "You are different," James said. "I told Lavinia this. You are the full version of yourself. I did not fully understand how long you had not been until I saw you now." Benjamin looked at his brother, and then at the yard where his son was demonstrating the correct technique for catching an unwilling hen to a fascinated 6-year-old from Ohio, and then at his wife in the doorway of the house his father-in-law had built and that he had repaired and extended, and that was now a real and complete home. "I stopped passing through," he said. "Yes," James said. "You did." That night, after the children were asleep and James and his wife had retired to the new west rooms, Benjamin and Lavinia sat on the porch in the warm summer dark the way they had sat every evening of that summer, side by side in the chairs Benjamin had built the previous winter, and the creek was a sound in the darkness, and the fireflies were in the willows, and the stars were the full summer stars of the Kansas plains, brilliant and present. "James is happy," Lavinia said. "Yes," Benjamin said. "The children are happy," she said. "Children are feral with happiness," he said, and she laughed, that full, real laugh that he had been making her laugh for 3 years and that still felt, every time, like the best thing he had done with his voice. "Are you happy?" she asked. He turned to look at her. She was watching the fireflies in the willows, her profile in the summer dark, the line of her jaw and her neck and the way her hair sat loose on her shoulders because she let it down in the evenings now, and he had learned to love it specifically that way. "Lavinia," he said. She turned. "I have been happy," he said, "every day since I walked into that alley, and I will be happy every day after this one. That is not a mood. That is a fact." She looked at him with those green eyes and said, "You are very good at making promises now, for a man who once told me he did not make them." "I had good instruction," he said. She reached across and took his hand in the dark, the same way she had taken his hand on this porch in the first autumn, cold and strong, and held it, and he held hers, and around them the summer night was full of sound and warmth and life. He had not made a promise to any living soul in 8 years, and then she had asked him for one small thing and he had made it. And from that one small promise in an alley in Caldwell, Kansas, in October 1879, everything else had followed, the way that first green shoots follow from a root that has been sleeping in cold ground and only needed a season to remember what it was made for. In the years after that, Benjamin Monroe made promises every day and kept every one of them. The small daily ones that add up to a life, that the fire would be lit, that the fence would be sound, that Thomas would have what he needed to grow into himself, and Mary Clara would have what she needed to be the particular force of nature she was clearly going to be. That he would be there in the mornings. That he would read whatever they could get their hands on and listen and talk. That he would not go. He was there. He stayed. The Monroe claim expanded over the following years. A modest but steady growth as Benjamin and Lavinia worked it with the practical intelligence they both brought to everything. By 1885, they ran 100 head of cattle and 40 acres of wheat, and the kitchen garden enterprise had grown to the point where Lavinia had taken on the neighbor's eldest daughter to help with the preserving work. Thomas Monroe, at 4 years old and then 5, followed his father through the fields and the barn with the absolute devotion of a boy who has decided that everything his father does is interesting and worth learning. And Benjamin taught him with the same patient thoroughness that he had used in repairing the house, explaining each step clearly and honestly, and trusting the boy to understand more than people generally expected children to understand. Mary Clara Monroe at 3 years old was, as predicted, trouble of the most excellent kind. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's complete directness, and she applied these qualities with a fearlessness that made the family dog, a black and white stock dog named Hector, who had appeared at the barn one morning in 1882 and been immediately claimed by Thomas, keep a respectful distance. She talked with great fluency and asked questions with a relentlessness that Benjamin found deeply entertaining. Because Lavinia fielded each question with the same seriousness she brought to adult conversation, treating the child's curiosity as a legitimate matter worthy of a real answer. "Why is the sky blue?" Mary Clara asked one afternoon standing in the kitchen doorway. "Because of the way light scatters in the atmosphere," Lavinia said, without looking up from the preserves she was working. "Your father can explain it more fully." "Papa," Mary Clara said, turning to Benjamin. "Sit down," Benjamin said, and spent the next half-hour explaining the scattering of light to a 3-year-old with the assistance of a cup of water and a piece of clear glass from the window, and the complete earnest attention of one Mary Clara Monroe who was, at 3, already impossible to underestimate. Lavinia watched this from across the kitchen with a warmth on her face that was not the warmth of sentiment so much as the warmth of deep satisfaction, the face of a woman who has exactly the life she chose and knows it. When Mary Clara finally ran outside to find Thomas and Hector and deliver the news about blue sky, Lavinia said, "She is going to be a scientist or a lawyer." "Why not both?" Benjamin said. "Why not both?" Lavinia agreed. Harlan Crail left Caldwell in 1883, moved further south into Indian Territory with his land and cattle ambitions, and the town relaxed slightly in his absence. The Sheriff Orrin Peel retired and was replaced by a younger man who wore his badge without embarrassment and who was, generally, a more reliable presence. Commerce Street grew another 2 businesses, and the church repaired its east wall with matching lumber for the first time. Caldwell was becoming, in the way of frontier towns that survive their roughest years, something like a real town. The Monroes were part of that, not centrally, not publicly, but in the way that solid people become part of a place, by being present and reliable, and by doing what they said they would do. Benjamin Monroe was known in Caldwell as a fair dealer and a good hand, a man who did not say much but meant what he said, and Lavinia Monroe was known as a woman of formidable competence who made the best apricot preserves in the county, and who had beaten Harlan Crail at the land office, and who ran her household and her land with a thoroughness that made her neighbors, most of them, feel better about the reliability of the world. In the spring of 1886, a 3rd child came, a son they named William Ellis Monroe, William for a great-grandfather and Ellis for the neighbor family who had been Thomas Gentry's friends. William was placid and sunny where Thomas had been intense, and Mary Clara had been formidable, and he came into the family like a warm afternoon, easy and bright, and Thomas at 5 years old took his responsibilities as elder brother with great seriousness, and Mary Clara at 4 years old tolerated William's existence with the air of someone who is being very generous. By the summer of 1886, the Monroe house was full in all the best ways. 3 children and a dog and the chickens in the yard, and the cattle on the south pasture, and the wheat in the east fields turning gold in the July heat, and the kitchen always smelling of something good, and the evenings on the porch with the fireflies and the creek sounds and the stars. Benjamin Monroe sat on the porch one July evening with Thomas asleep against his shoulder, the boy worn out from a day of chasing, and being chased and climbing things that were not meant to be climbed, and Lavinia beside him with William asleep in her arms and Mary Clara inside already in bed with the thoroughness of a child who runs until she stops, and the prairie was dark and vast and soft around them. "I want to tell you something," Benjamin said. "Tell me," Lavinia said. 8 years of moving," he said. 8 years of dust and distance and not feeling anything particularly on purpose. I was careful about it. I was very deliberate. I thought that not feeling was the same as not losing, and I thought that was a reasonable trade." "It is not," Lavinia said gently. "No," he said, "it is not. You get both or neither. That is the whole truth of it. You cannot have the good without accepting that the good can be taken, and that is frightening. And I was frightened for 8 years disguised as a man who was not afraid of anything." She turned her head and looked at him. "I am not frightened now," he said. "I know I could lose this. I know the world does not promise anything to anyone. I know that." He paused. "And I am not frightened because what is here is worth the risk of it completely and without question, and I would rather have had this. Have you and Thomas and Mary Clara and William and this land and this house and these 8 years of porch evenings, for whatever time I have, than had the safety of the nothing I was living in." Lavinia looked at him for a long moment, with the sleeping baby in her arms and the sleeping boy against his shoulder, and the summer dark around them and the fireflies in the willows. "Benjamin Monroe," she said, "you have become a very eloquent man." "You did that," he said. "I only gave you a reason to speak," she said. "The eloquence was always yours." He looked at her in the soft dark, his wife, the woman who had stood in an alley in October and asked him for one small thing and had not expected him to come but had asked anyway because asking was what she did. She asked for exactly what she needed and no more, and she made it possible to give it, and he had given it, and from that one small morning in front of the land office all of this. "Lavinia," he said. "What?" she said. "I love you," he said. "Every day, the same way, more." She leaned her head against his shoulder with the sleeping William between them and said, "I love you. That has not changed once." They sat in the summer dark on the porch of the house they had made, on the land that was hers and then theirs, with their children asleep against them and the creek in the willows and the stars everywhere above the Kansas plain. And Benjamin Monroe was home, completely and finally and without reservation, in the only way that a man who has wandered for 8 years can be home, which is to say totally, all the way down, with nothing left outside. He had not made a promise to any living soul in 8 years, and she had asked him for one small thing, and he had made it and kept it. And from that kept promise, everything else had followed and was still following, day by day and season by season, full of ordinary, extraordinary life, and he never stopped, not for a single day, keeping it. The summer of 1886 turned to fall, and the fall to winter, and the winter to another spring, and the Monroe claim greened again with the new grass, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the cattle moved on the south pasture, and Thomas Monroe, 6 years old and already taller than his mother's waist, came running across the yard one April morning to tell his father that the first meadowlark of the season was in the fence line along the east pasture, singing. Benjamin Monroe set down his tools and walked with his son to the fence line in the April morning, and they stood side by side, man and boy, and listened to the meadowlark in the new grass with the sky deep and wide above them, and the land spread green in every direction. And Thomas took his father's hand because he was still young enough to do that without thinking about it. And Benjamin held his son's hand and listened to the bird, and felt the complete and total fullness of a life that had been made from one small promise, kept.